Okay, in Bill's story. So if you look in Bill's story on page 1 in the big book, you'll see the word I. If you look, it's about used 10 times in the first page. It's all about Bill, and he was a war hero. He came from the war, and I guess World War I. And he says, I was part of life at last. I forgot the strong warnings. And he goes on to say, I was lonely, and he word the word I. On page 2, he goes on to talk about himself. In the second paragraph on page 2, the drive for success was on. I'd prove to the world I was important. So here we go. We're getting a message here. Bill is talking about all about Bill and himself. And he goes on to say, I. And he goes on. And then on bottom page 3, he wanted to become a famous golfer. On the very bottom, in 1929, I contracted golf fever. Went at once to the country, my wife, to applaud what I started out to overcome Walter Hagen, who was a famous golfer of the time. Oh, on page 2, he's also talking, let's go back to there, where he said, I proved to the world I was important on the top of page 2. My work took me to Wall Street, and little by little, I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, and why not I? I studied economics and business as well. Again, the word I. Now, there's a reason why we're saying he used the word I in many places in here. On page 4, he talked about his experience, and all this was all about him. You'll see the word I used about 20 times on that page. He goes on to talk about his experiences. So let's go over to, he got drunk one night, and on page 6, first full paragraph, the remorse, heart, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. The courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. So we could experience that with any addiction. And then at the end of that first paragraph, then the mental fog settled down. Gin would fix that. We could say addiction, whatever it is, food could fix that. And so 2 bottles and more oblivion. So his way out of it was to use the alcohol as a way to go into oblivion, to forget all his problems. And we could say we could do that with a lot of us here have other addiction we do that with, of course. He was at the very, very bottom. Matter of fact, on the bottom page 6, he took his mattress to the lower floor because he was afraid he was going to jump out the window. He was really desperate. So it's showing how Bill, where he wanted to be a famous golfer, be famous on Wall Street. And of course, it's amazing the history here. This was actually in 1929 when he was there when the stock market crashed. The whole thing is, it has a lot of history to it. And then he got to desperation to the jumping off point on bottom page 6. Then he went back in the hospital, page 7. They put him on hydrotherapy. They put him on belladonna treatment on the first full paragraph of page 7. Again, this is talking about different ways the medical field is trying to resolve it. And the same with today. We try all of these different medical treatments with our, it could be surgery, or we take these pills and all these different diets to trying to do it. If you liked the video so far, press the like and subscribe button. So he goes on, next paragraph, at the very bottom, it says, surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. So this goes to step 1. But step 1 says we're powerless. So all through the book, and here it talks about self-knowledge. And he felt he found it. He was in the hospital. He found the self-knowledge. But he says, but it was not, for the frightful day came, and I drank once again. On page 8, it is pretty interesting. And this page really came in the first few times I read it. But the more I go through the book, it's just opened up. And every time I read it, it's really amazing. Because it talks about on page 8, in the first full paragraph, no words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in a bitter morass of self-pity. Again, I said the reason I was talking about he talked about I throughout the first part of the big book is because here he goes again. He's talking about the self, his self-pity. He's still into the self. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. Now, how many of us have felt that way in our addiction? That with loneliness, the despair, and the self-pity. I had met my match, right? Alcohol. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol, we could say addiction to food, was my master, my higher power. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital, broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insanity of the first drink on Armistice Day, 1934. I was off again. And he goes on to say, Everyone resigned, that certainty I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to the miserable end. How many of us felt that way? It's called hitting bottom. Here it's talking about living our life and seeing what Bill and relating to ourselves. But then he says, I was soon, another sentence down further, to be catapulted in what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. This is amazing. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. How amazing is that? To be happy and peaceful, but to get more incredible as time passes. Because sometimes people come in the meeting, they call it a pink cloud. They really didn't work the steps, but they see some glimmer of hope. And people say to me, that pink cloud's going to go away. And a lot of times it does. But when you work these steps, it says it gets more incredible, that pink cloud. It doesn't go away the more we work this program. So here, this is the story here when Ebby comes in. Here's Bill in his kitchen table in Brooklyn. And this is really something here, Near the end of the bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. So here, Bill is all alone in his kitchen drinking. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through the night and the next day. You could relate to all of this. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I had dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of the bed. I would need it before daylight. Then his telephone rings, it says. This is on page 8, the very bottom. The cheery voice of an old school friend said if he might come over, he was sober, in italics. So it goes on, and he remembered him. He talks about how he remembered him just as a down-and-out alcoholic. I was amazed. Rumor had it he had been committed for alcohol insanity. Wondered how he had escaped. Of course, we would have dinner. Then I could drink openly with him. Well, this is what happened. And Dr. Silkworth spoke about the same way in Bill when he was in Townsend Hospital in New York City. On page 9, in the middle, the door opened. There he stood, fresh skin and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? So in this program, it talks about being reborn. Here he saw a man, and he was completely different. And so he goes on to say, I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. And before that, he says, I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. So wouldn't it be great in our addiction we have that awakening? We could just refuse it. Just didn't mean anything to us. So what happened? I queried, Bill asked. He looked at me straight at me and simply smiled. He said, I've got religion. So here we're talking about this program is all about this religious, spiritual experience through the steps and how it turned him into a new man. And he goes on to say, near the bottom, and as a matter of fact, he told of how 2 men had appeared in court persuading a judge to suspend his commitment. They had told him of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. That was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. And he came to, so here was, the Oxford group, right? Back to the 6 steps we talked about in the forward to the editions. I think the second edition speaks about that, the 6 steps of the Oxford group. If you liked the video so far, press the like and subscribe button. Come to our free Zoom meeting. See info in description. Now back to our video. He said, I was interested I was hopeless. So he realized he was hopeless, which was good. Right? He finally, wouldn't you say that's step 1? We're going through the steps here. We admitted that we were powerless, so alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. So he had said that's step 1 on the top of 10 when Bill said he was hopeless. So he goes on to talk about he always believed in a power greater than myself. I often ponder these things. And he goes on to discuss it a little bit, but he really did or didn't believe it. Then he goes on to say, I simply had to believe in a spirit of the universe who knew neither time nor limitation, but that was as far as I'd gone. When ministers in world religion, so he was turned off to the world religions. He really wasn't a spiritual person or believing in that. That's where he was at right at that point on page 10. Okay, on page 11, in the middle of the page, so before the few paragraphs before the middle of the page, Bill is talking about how he sort of doubts and doesn't really understand, and he's in his mind, he's going through the spirituality and God or God consciousness or whatever you want to call it. And he used the word but on page 11 in the middle, but my friend sat before me. So here he sees proof of it before him, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. Step 1. It's all step 1 right here. We're going through the steps through the first 103 pages of the big book. His human will had failed. That he had in effect been raised from the dead and suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. So he was hitting bottom, but from hitting bottom, he's leaped into, catapulted, as they say here, into very higher place of being, as he says in page 8, into the fourth dimension. He was a way of life is incredibly more wonderful as time passes, and happiness, and I was to know happiness and peace. So, page 12, he talks a little bit more about his prejudices, and on the top of the page, he says, I didn't like the idea in the middle of the first paragraph. I could go for such conceptions as creative, intelligent, universal mind, and spirit of the universe. But his friend suggested to him this. Ebby was said to him, listen, he says, why don't you, it's in the middle of page 12, in italics, choose your own conception of God. And this is what happened to Bill. Bill says, that statement hit me hard and melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. The intellectual mountain, right? The will, the intellect. Couldn't cut it. Our best thinking got us here, right? We can't figure this whole thing out, but that's what Bill says here. It melted. All of this self-analyzation, figuring out and trying to control it, step one, melted. It was only matter, but this is actually step two, because here he became to believe that possibly he could be restored to sanity through a higher power. It only became a matter of willing to believe, on italics in the middle page, and power greater than myself, nothing more was required to make my beginning. So the first three steps are really just acknowledging it. It's not really an action steps, but it's saying, acknowledging the first three steps. This is step two, the willingness to believe. So he says the scales, a little bit further down, of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. A new world came into view. So he was a prisoner of the self, the ego. And here it's saying that it's sort of like he started to have a spiritual awakening here. He started to see a new world come into view. We see the world through, very finite. We see it through our food addiction. That's what we see during the day. Or it could be alcohol, be drugs, or people, or money, or success. But here all of a sudden he saw there was another way of thinking. The old way didn't work. It's called being reborn. And we talk about in step 3, relieve me of bondage of self. So actually they're talking about step 3 there, right? I believe scales of pride and prejudice, step 3. Relieve me of bondage of self. A new world came into view. He was reborn. Okay, and it goes on the bottom. He saw he's starting to believe in God, but what happened? He says, but soon the sense of his presence on the bottom of page 12 been blotted out by worldly clamors, mostly those within myself. This is so amazing, this sentence. It's telling him the problem. What happened was, and that's why we live in steps 10, 11, and 12 in this program. And we'll keep on working the steps daily. Because all of a sudden he had an awakening here, and then all of a sudden he's dragged back into the things of material, things of the flesh, things of alcohol, food, whatever it is, money, things like that. And it blots it out. It takes it away. It steals you, robs you, and it keeps you a prisoner out of the worldly clamors. So it says, blotted out by the worldly clamors, those within himself. So the world is out there. But we interpret how the way we interpret the world is what we put ourselves in that prison. We're the ones doing it. So that phrase, those within myself. But before that, in myself also, before I worked these steps, I was blaming everything on the outside. This was the problem. That was the problem. I needed more of this to make me happy. But here he's saying the problem is within ourselves. Now, how blind I had been. I was blind, but now I see, right? The song from the song Amazing Grace. So he finally realized step 2 was part of step 2. His insanity had to be restored to sanity, and he found a way to do that. So step 3 again, there I humbly offered my... So here we go on page 13. You could do this right now as we do. Bill's going through the steps. So as we read page 13, and as you're sitting there, you can go through the steps. There I humbly offered myself to God as I understood him, as it talks about, as you understand him, to do with me as he would. So all of a sudden, step 3, give my will and my life over as he would. He's finally surrendered. And remember, that's why the whole beginning of the book we're talking about, Bill is saying, I, me, self this, self-pity. He was into the self and he was being dragged down by the self. And he said, so the solution to him, I offered myself to God to do with me as he willed. Step 3, I place myself unreservedly under his care and direction. Right? Step 3, when we do that, we don't have to try to control. We don't have to be upset anymore. We could be released because we have a partner in life, so to speak. Someone, somewhere we could have confidence and faith in. The word faith is a word, right? Step 3, faith, spirituality. For the first time, that of myself, I was nothing. Humility, right? Step 7 talks about humility. I was nothing. Getting out of the self, the ego, humility. Without him in a spirituality, we're lost. Trying to figure it out, we're lost, totally lost. I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have my newfound friend take them away, root and branch. I have never had a drink since. So that's step 4, ruthlessly face my defects of character. But it doesn't say here in its sentence to do them or take them out. It says, but became willing to have my newfound friend take them away. Right? To willing to have a sponsor, have God of his understanding take them away by this new God consciousness and take them away root and branch. I have not had a drink since. He had no conception of life. The alcohol is no longer his higher power. Just like we make our food a higher power, we can replace that need for the food with spirituality. So it just goes on to say, and we're talking about, I had not had a drink since. So actually, we were talking about 4, 5, 6, and 7. 4 was when he faced his defects of character, took his inventory. And 5 is when he found his newfound friend and he gave him to God and somebody else. Confession and gave him the way. And 6 and 7 talking about the willingness and humility to let God do it. Next paragraph on page 13, my schoolmate visited me. I was fully acquainted with my problems of deficiency. We made a list, step 8, of people I had hurt or toward whom I felt resentment. Step 8. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals and admit my wrong. Never was I to be critical of them. So why does it say not be critical of them? And it talks about later on in the book, the inventory is ours, not the other person's. So before it was always everybody else. If they would only be right, if they would only act right, everyone else was the problem. When I realized the problem was me in those cases, I was the common denominator. And even if somebody didn't act right, it was my reaction to what they did that was the problem. It was ego, self-centered pride, all the defects of character. I was to right all such matters and to the most of my ability, step 9. So here we are in step 10. We're going through the steps right here, page 13, with Bill. I was to test my thinking by new God consciousness within. So step 10, perseverance, reviewing our day. Common sense would become uncommon sense. I love that phrase. Common sense, our common sense to that point didn't help us before we worked these steps, had the spiritual awakening. The common sense told us we could figure it out. A common sense with our food addiction, we could control it. All we had to do was do this, but we never changed our perception, which these steps bring us to that spiritual awakening. So common sense is like logic or intellect, I guess he's saying here. But we need an uncommon sense. I was to sit quietly when in doubt. How beautiful is that? So if you have a problem, or you have an addiction, or something's bothering you in life, it doesn't say to go out and do it. It says to sit quietly, asking only. So we just ask for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. Doing God's will, not my will. Thy will be done. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my request bore my usefulness to others. So spiritual awakening, step 12, is helping others and practicing this in all our affairs. Because then praying for the self is saying, in actuality, when I pray for myself, I want to better this or more of this or more of that. I'm really putting myself back into the ego because I'm looking for the momentary pleasure in life. Here's a spiritual awakening is when we don't need more. We already got everything, so what more do we have to pray for? All we have is the spirituality. We're creating God's image, God's will. Then only might I expect to receive. What's the phrase? If you give out, you get 10 times back. But when we grab, and greed is one, right? Greed, lust, envy, deadly sins. Then might I only expect to receive, but that would be in great measure. So the more we give, 10 times we receive, in great measure. My friend promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator that would have the elements, a way of living that answered all my problems. It said when we read the forwards, it said about an answer to all our problems, and it talks about it again here. On page 14, it says, simple but not easy. This is amazing here on page 14, the first full paragraph. It's just 2 sentences. A price had to be paid. So it's telling us what we have to do. Do we have to go intellectualize this, figure everything out in the whole world and go tell everybody our problems? No, it tells us what to do. It meant destruction of self-centeredness, humility. And it's telling us what we must do. You know, there are a lot of musts in this book. It's about 26 in this first part of the big book. Sometimes a sponsor will have a sponsee or somebody write down all the must sentences here. I must turn all things to the Father of light who presides over all of us all.